There we go. Presenters today are Deanna Apps. She's a physical scientist from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the Detroit District. Adam Betchel, he's a coastal engineer outreach specialist with Wisconsin Sea Grant. And then Julie Kinzelman is a laboratory division director for the City of Racine Public Health. And I am now going to pass it off to Deanna. And Deanna, I'm going to give you, if you're ready, control. I just got to find you on my screen to do.
All right, I'm ready.
All right. Make presenter. Yes. All right. It should ask you to present, and you just have to click yes, and then you are in control. Hopefully it all works.
Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for having me today. I'm going to talk about just water levels across the Great Lakes, some, how it has looked over these last few years, and go over some basin hydrology as well. My name is Deanna Apps. I work out of the Hydraulics and Hydrology office in the Detroit District. And just to start, we have just a few pictures here on some of the high water we've seen throughout these last couple years. And I will now get started here. So monitoring Great Lakes water levels. So just to start, I always like to just go over the Great Lakes Basin as a whole. As you can see on the right graphic, the more aerial image, you can see everything highlighted in that green area is denoted as the Great Lakes Basin. So every drop of water that falls into that region, either in the green area or over the lakes, is accounted for as the water supply to one of the lakes. It's a very, very large basin, obviously international basin, covering both land in the U.S. and Canada. And then this diagram here on the left is a side profile view of the basin, which is really helps to represent how water flows through the system. So beginning in Lake Superior, water flows through the St. Mary's River into Lakes Michigan and Huron, through the St. Clair River into Lake St. Clair, through the Detroit River into Lake Erie, through the Niagara River into Lake Ontario, and lastly, out through the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I do want to note on this slide that there are two places in the system where outflows are regulated. One through the St. Mary's River that connects Lake Superior into Lakes Michigan and Huron, and then the other one out of Lake Ontario through the St. Lawrence River. Regulation of these outflows is the responsibility of their respective boards of control. So the International Lake Superior Board of Control and the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Board of Control, all under the authority of the International Joint Commission. However, I want to stress that regulation of outflows cannot prevent extreme high or low water levels, nor can it fully control water levels. Water levels are mainly driven by weather and Mother Nature, and that's something that I'll touch on as we go through this presentation. So the next thing I want to talk about is some of our water level reports that we provide on our website, which is the link is at the bottom of the slide. We report daily water levels for each of the lakes. So that's, you can see here for Lake Superior, Michigan, Huron, St. Clair, Erie, and Ontario. You can see Michigan, Huron. We consider Michigan, Huron one lake when we're reporting water levels or when we're doing our forecasts, due to the fact that they're connected at the Straits of Mackinac. So from a hydraulic standpoint, they rise and fall together. So this is an example of the water level report you could see on our webpage. This, like I said, daily water levels as well as monthly mean water levels across the bottom here, and then some statistics as well. You can also see a graphic which I've displayed here on the right, comparing water levels from where they are now to where they were last year, comparing them to the monthly means and the record highs, monthly mean levels as well. And it also has our 6-month coordinated forecast on there, which is something I'll talk about later on in the presentation as well. So how do we come up with these daily lake-wide average water levels? And we used a few gauges across each of the lakes to help represent what that water level is. So this is really the monitoring network across the Great Lakes. All those blue dots are gauges on the U.S. side of the basin and run by NOAA. And then all the green dots are the Canadian gauges, and they're operated by the Canadian Hydrographic Service. Any dot that you're seeing that is more bolded in color, and that is representative of a gauge that we use in the lake-wide average network. So I've highlighted here on the bottom for each lake the locations of where the gauges are that we use when we calculate that daily water level. So you can see, like for Lake Superior, we use 5 gauges to help calculate that daily lake-wide average water level. Lake Michigan Huron, we use 6 different gauges, and so on and so forth. Here you can see for the other lakes as well. So that's how we're using those gauges across the lake surface to give us more of that average water level across the entire lake surface. So you will see in specific locations there is going to be likely greater variability than what you're seeing in that lake-wide daily average water level. So next I'm going to kind of transition here to factors that are impacting water levels. And like we've already talked about, we have to consider inflow from the upstream lake. So for example, if we're talking about Lake Michigan Huron, we have to account for inflow from the St. Mary's River. And then we also have to account for the outflow out of that lake, which would be through the St. Clair River. Then we also have to account for what we term net basin supply. And we have to consider precipitation to the lake, runoff to the lake, and evaporation off of the lake surface. So those are the 3 main variables that we're tracking to help us understand the water supply to the lake over a certain time period. So what does this look like on an annual basis? So water levels, go through an annual cycle where typically during the winter months where snow is accumulating, the ground is typically frozen, is typically when we see that seasonal low in water levels. As we transition more into the spring months, as the snow melts and rainfall occurs, we see increased runoff in the region, and that leads to the spring rise in water levels. As we reach the summer months, that's usually when we see the peak in water level. And increased sunshine helps to warm the lake water, and that's very important as we head into the fall and early winter months. As colder air starts to move into the region and moves over that relatively warm lake surface, that's when we induce evaporation, and that increased evaporation during those fall and early winter months is the primary driver of water level decline. So right now we're in the period of seasonal decline across the Great Lakes. So this is our full period of record that stretches back to 1918 of monthly mean water levels for each of the lakes. So you can see a hydrograph here for Lake Superior, Lake Michigan Huron, St. Clair, Erie, and Ontario. And what you can see, just by, taking a quick skim at the graphic, you can see that throughout the last 100+ years, we have gone through periods of both high and low water. You can see some, for example, Lake Michigan Huron, you can see some of the low water here in the mid 1960s. You can see that high water that occurred in the mid to late 1980s. And then we can see even that transition to low water in the late 1990s, where we had a decade plus of low water that also had record lows on Lake Superior and Lake Michigan Huron. And then after that, we can see a record rise in water levels over the next 2 to 3 years, especially on Lake Superior and Michigan Huron. And really since then, even though we've gone through our annual cycle where, water levels are rising in the spring and declining in the fall, on an annual basis, we've been steadily rising due to that really increased precipitation, which I'll talk to on the next slide, and which has led us to some of these record high water levels we've seen in 2019 and 2020. So why are water levels so high? And as I hinted to on the last slide, there's really been a persistent wet pattern in the Great Lakes region. And what you're looking at here, this is Great Lakes Basin precipitation from January to December, so annual precipitation. And we're looking at this as a time series from 1895 all the way through 2019. And you can see here that they've on the plot is an average between 1901 and 2000. So this is the mean, mean of or average precipitation over that 100-year period. And you can see that, you know, for the early parts of the, you know, 1895 or, you know, till, you know, really like the mid 1980s, you know, we were fluctuating, you know, up in, you know, above and below this line. But then you can see even especially recently in the, you know, late 2000s here, we start to see predominantly precipitation above average. And then these last 3 years, 2017, 18, and 19, we've seen exceptionally wet conditions in the region. And that's really helped, you know, get us to that period of low water to now the period of high water. And just a side note, because this is a NOAA product, this is a reflection of only precipitation on the U.S. side of the borders. Just want to make that clarification too. Just wanted to briefly go over some of the current conditions in the region. So this is percent of normal precipitation from July 1st through September 30th. So the most recent 3-month period. And you can see by the, you know, the oranges and yellows you're seeing, that's typically representation of precipitation that's below normal. Some of the greens, blue, purple that you're seeing like up in the UP, that's indicative of precipitation above normal. So you can see it has been a little bit drier, you know, here in Western Michigan, but still, you know, fairly wet up in the Upper Peninsula and in parts of Wisconsin. And, you know, even, you know, a little bit into Minnesota where they're seeing kind of below normal precipitation. And then I just wanted to show September stream flows as well. So stream flows are a good indication of runoff in the region. And, you know, typically, you know, if you were to look at this from last year, it would likely have looked a little bit wetter. You can see, especially in the eastern portions of the Great Lakes basins, like on Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, you can see that the stream flows are much below normal. So we are seeing that drying out, and that's indicative even in the soil moisture anomaly change that you're seeing from end of July to October 20th. Anything in these yellows indication that the soils are getting drier. And you can see that, you know, here in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario basins, as well as even some of it in the upper lakes as well. So just to go over some of the forecasts for this upcoming winter, a La Nina is forecast for this winter. It developed in August, and what that means is that sea surface temperatures in the central and equatorial Pacific Ocean are below normal. And that has impacts on our overall weather pattern that we'll see in the region. And that's the graphic that I've included here on the right. This is a typical wintertime La Nina pattern where we see colder air intrusion into the central U.S., central northern U.S., and then wetter conditions are likely, especially in southern portions of the Great Lakes Basin. And this is, again, just a typical pattern. Doesn't mean it's definitely going to happen, but this is, like I said, a typical pattern for wintertime La Nina conditions, based on, historical La Nina events. So for that reason, you can see in the Climate Prediction Center's seasonal outlooks starting this winter in December, January, February, pretty much all the way through May, June, July, we're seeing the likelihood of above normal precipitation in a majority of the Great Lakes region. And that's indicative by those greenish colors over the Great Lakes Basin. So due to that La Nina forecast, it is more likely that we could see some wetter conditions come the winter and early springtime. So that's something to, just to keep an eye on as well. So I'm going to briefly talk here about the 6-month forecast for which we did in the beginning of October, from October to March. We'll do one again next week for the beginning of November. I'll just show here for the essence of time, Lake Superior and Lake Michigan Huron. But what I've noted here on the graphic are the 2019 record highs, which you can see here. I've highlighted those in the yellow. And then the purple here are the 2020 provisional records that we've set on Lake Superior. As you can see here, we've really been below some of these records from last year in 2019. So far in 2020, at least through May through September. That September 2020 level was about 3 inches below the September 2019 record high level. But as you can see, as I mentioned, we're in the period of seasonal decline, and we are forecasting water levels to be below record highs, but still above average. This average is this blue dashed line that you're seeing. So still expect water levels to be high, but still, like I said, below some of these records that we've seen. And then the Lake Michigan Huron, a little different story here. You can see that, in 2019, Lake Michigan Huron actually didn't set a monthly mean water level record, although you can tell just by the line, this red line, that it came close in multiple months, I should say. But then beginning in January, we started to set record high monthly mean water levels, and that continued for 8 consecutive months all the way through August. September was the first month this year we dropped below record high, but we're still 3 inches above last year. But as you can see, as I mentioned with Lake Superior, we are in the period of seasonal decline here, and we are forecasting water levels to be below record highs over the next 6 months, which includes some of those provisional records of 2020. But as you can see for Lake Michigan Huron, comparing to average, we're well above average on this lake, and you can tell that by this foot axis here on the left. You can see that I should have mentioned on the first graphic, these are all measured off chart datum, which is the 0 line. So if you're trying to estimate a water level, each of these lines is about 2 inches. So, if you wanted to estimate a water level, you would just, plus 2 inches, plus 4, so on and so on, until you get to plus 1 foot. So, and then based off that chart datum reference, which is about 577.5 feet. So, we are still well above average on Lake Michigan Huron, but we do expect water levels to be below record highs over the next 6 months. I know I'm cutting close on time here. I'll briefly go over this slide and just say that we do provide a water level outlook that looks out 12 months. We don't use it as a forecast. We use it as a tool to help show how we think water levels could be over the next 12 months based on historical water supply data. So as I mentioned earlier, we have net basin supply, which is precipitation plus runoff minus evaporation. That's what's called net basin supply. We have that data going back to 1900. So when we route all those net basin supply sequences through our regulation and routing model, that gray range that you're seeing are the potential water levels that could occur based off historical water supplies that we've seen to the lakes. So that's really what this is showing. And, it's on our website. So, there's a nice little write-up there. So if you want more information on this product too, and also I'd be happy to answer questions on it as well. So, just here are the, really some of the key points. Water level fluctuations primarily driven by weather and hydrologic conditions. Water levels in 2020 have continued to be near above record high levels on all lakes except Lake Ontario. Again, the point on regulation of outflows really not being able to prevent extreme high or low water levels. And we're still seeing the impacts of high water so far, and likely will continue here in the recent coming months. And this is the last slide just my contact information is here below. Deanna Apps, my phone number and email. This is also my supervisor, and he'll be available to answer any questions, and just a link to our high water webpage that has a lot of great resources on it. So with that, I will end, and I'll keep this going. So.
Thanks, Deanna.
Thanks, Deanna. We did have one question come in from the chat.
Okay.
From Karen. Would more water gauges in the lakes assist with predictions, or is there an adequate number of gauges already in place? I
mean, there are quite a few gauges in place, and Really, and if you're looking for more, I know that it's not so much a forecast, but if you're really looking for more of a water level at a specific location, I would go to the NOAA, tides and currents page, or I think there's a similar product on the Canadian side as well that has more of their water level gauges than maybe we would use in our network. And so there are a sufficient amount. But it's just there's a lot of the water level changes can occur day to day. If there's a big wind event, they're just fluctuating very very much, even just day to day. That it can be hard to pin down maybe what a specific water level is at an exact location.
And one final question from Mark. Is a summary of monthly streamflow graphics for each lake available on your webpage as well?
Those streamflow graphics are from USGS. You can go back and look at archived monthly maps of those on their website. If you Google like USGS streamflows, you should be able to get to the page. I think it's called like Water Watch or something like that.
All right. Thank you, Deanna. Adam is next, and Adam Betchel is from US Sea Grant, and I am going to make you a presenter, Adam. Do you see it?
All right. Is my slide deck up?
Got it.
All right. Thanks for having me today. I'm Adam Beckley, Coastal Engineering Outreach Sea Grant. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the implications of water levels and how they change our beaches. And I'm sure a lot of you could tell me a long story about what you've seen over the past couple of years. But I'll try to talk a little bit about the processes and talk a bit about how you might be able to utilize these changes. So pictures we have here are something I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. When we had low water levels back in the early 2010s, we had beaches in a lot of places that currently maybe are much smaller, or in this case, gone in 2019 here. A little flip side, in some cases, we have beaches that have gotten slightly wider. So this is taken from up in Lake Superior on Bark Bay. In 2012, when there were low water levels, we had a beach here, but in 2018, that beach has grown quite a bit, so much so that the sand is overtopping that little boat launch groin there and causing issues with needing dredging. And that's partly because of all the erosion that's happened because of the high water levels, mobilizing that sediment and it getting collected there. So I think many of you probably wish you had that issue where your beach got wider, but there is more nuance to the discussion about water levels than just beaches get covered up or inundated or get smaller. So kind of some of the things I'm going to talk about today are how water levels kind of directly affect beach loss and what other processes are at play. And then how can you visualize this change, particularly maybe at your beach? So here is my initial cartoon of a beach. We have, let's call it low water levels, and we have our beach berm and maybe a dune back here and an upland bank maybe. When water levels get higher, certainly that water will inundate the beach that it covers and make the beach smaller. But we don't have water levels in a vacuum. We have coastal storms and waves on top of that. And that can make the situation a bit more complex. Now I'll say the sort of first cut estimate of the beach is covered in water is a pretty good approximation of how much beach is gone. But I do want to talk a bit about the other processes at play. So once we start talking about those processes, my cartoon skills are underwhelming, and so I got to go to the pros. So this figure is showing what happens when waves strike the beach. And so at the top, we see a normal beach profile. I see the water level and the waves hitting the beach berm. When we have large waves, those waves start to remove sediment from the beach berm and then start moving that sand offshore. And, you know, those waves can reach up to the dune, start taking some of that normally dry sand and pull it off into the water. That sand's not gone forever. It sort of settles out underwater. So the beach is still out there underwater. It's just in a little bit different form. And then when we have our more gentle waves, that sand can get pushed back up onto the shore and reform our beach berm and form our dunes. So when we're talking about Great Lakes water level change, we don't have as simple of a situation as this figure. The water levels go up. That makes it that much easier for those large waves to take more sediment, more sand, and move further up the beach and take more of it away. Again, that sand still gets kind of pulled out into the offshore, ready to be pushed back onshore. And that's much easier to do when water levels get lower because there's more real estate for that sand to get pushed up onto. So this is a simple figure. Water levels certainly kind of make this, kind of exacerbate these changes, and we see erosion move inland as water level gets higher. But as water levels get lower, we might expect to see that sand get pushed back up onshore and our beaches get wider again. Not just because the water levels are lower, but also because that sand is getting moved back to the beach. This is sort of the simplified case if the waves struck the beach directly, but we know that the waves don't strike the beach head on. A lot of times they come in at an angle. And so this induces a longshore sediment transport, whereas the waves come in at that angle, they push the sand up and start pushing it down the beach in the direction of the waves, creating a longshore current. And so this means that the sand that comes directly off this part of the beach doesn't necessarily sit right out here. It gets pushed along the shore. If you had a wide, uniform beach, you wouldn't notice much changes. But of course, we know, again, this is not something that lives in a vacuum. And so this cartoon illustrates kind of the different changes. So right here, when the waves strike on, we don't see a whole lot of longshore sediment transport. But when the waves come at an angle, they might push the sand along. It will get collected. Over here, we see a coastal structure that's there and starts to get taken away, carving out this sort of profile. So the waves do come in multiple directions, sometimes, you know, from the north, sometimes from the south, depending on your beach orientation. It'll move the sand back and forth, but typically there's a predominant direction that the waves come from, and we see that borne out on how our coast changes. But the natural coast is not in a vacuum either. Human interaction with the coast and building structures can also change this as well. So we see different types of structures, particularly now as people are responding to erosion at the high water levels. One type is a shore perpendicular structure, familiarly called groins. And so this interacts with the longshore sediment transport as we see sand pushed along the coast. In this cartoon, the dominant wind and wave directions from left to right. We see sand get accumulated on the left side of this groin, and it's not making it to the right side of the groin, and we see erosion. So that's where really longshore sediment transport can really cause some long-term beach changes, and that all gets exacerbated by water levels. When structures are built parallel to the shore, thinking like a seawall or a revetment, that can have a little bit different impact on the coast. So we can see initially when the seawall is built, we might have a beach, but that seawall or revetment offers a hard structure for the waves to reflect onto, making it a high energy wave environment right in front of it and harder for beach sand or sediment to settle back out and create a beach either when water levels are lower or when the wave energy dies down. So we can see some long-term changes there. Typically, I'd say when you build a revetment, you kind of trade off having a beach. Another thing that happens is there's
some guy talking about beach erosion right now, so it's not directly relevant to what we're talking about.
So someone might not be muted. I think that's not me. But as more and more of these structures get built, less sediment is made available into the longshore sediment transport system. really reducing how much sand is available to build beaches, particularly when water levels get back down low. So all these kind of effects add up and can create beach loss, particularly at high water levels. When water levels go back low, we would expect beaches to kind of return and have some width. But if we have changes like shore protection structures going in, that might change the nearshore transport of sediment. That's where we might not see our beaches come back as wide as they would before this high water level period. So how can we visualize the changes that have been going on? One great tool for all you folks in Wisconsin is the Wisconsin Shoreline Inventory and Oblique Photo Viewer. This is funded by the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program and put together by Association of State Floodplain Managers. For those of you who want to find this or follow along at home, the Wisconsin Shoreline Viewer, if you type that into your favorite web search, you should be able to find this tool pretty easily. So what does this tool do? Well, up in the right-hand corner, you can kind of pick where you want to explore. So in this case, we'll sort of set the stage for our next presentation and go to Racine. So we click Racine County and we're zoomed in there. To zoom in further, we hit the zoom button here and we can zoom in to where the Racine Harbor is. And on the left-hand side here, we can see what sort of information is available. One of the most valuable things is oblique photos of the coast. We have a set from the 1970s and then early 2000s, 2012, 2016, and then they've been acquired pretty much yearly since then. There is a set of 2020 photos that are not on the viewer yet, but they will hopefully be up shortly. So looking at what we can see here, if we look at North Beach right by Racine Harbor here, back in the 70s, this was following a period of high water. We see where the beach was kind of right about at the point where the harbor starts. We fast forward in time to 2012, as we remember from Dee's presentation and maybe our own experience, water levels were pretty low then, getting close to all-time record highs. And we see the beach is much wider, and we can see that effect of this shore perpendicular structure trapping sediment. In this case, sediment flows from north to south, or in this picture, right to left, and traps there, making the beach wider. As you might expect, 2019 photo, that beach is much narrower, so we can really visualize kind of what's been happening at this site. Going a little bit further up the coast, in 2012, we see this area, this beach in between a handful of groins. And as you might expect, those groins modify how the sediment transport goes along the coast, and we might expect to see kind of the most water level impacts in this area in between the groins. So if we move from 2012, again at low water levels, up to 2017, as water levels are rising, pretty much all that beach is gone. We see more beach over here in between those groins, and then a little bit of beach over here on the other side of the groin, but pretty much that's kind of the place that got hit the hardest pretty quickly when water levels rose, partly because of the water level change, but also because of the modifications to nearshore sediment transport that those coastal structures impart. And then, of course, 2019, water levels are higher, and we see pretty much no beach in there at all. Still some beach held by those groins and a little bit more beach held by the groins in here, but definitely hit pretty hard right there. Encouraging look back in time, though, in 1970s, following a period of high water levels, this beach area in between the groins is pretty sparse with sediment as well. And we saw by 2012 with low water levels that did have some beach come back. So that does sort of illustrate the changes through time that water levels impart on the beaches. And if we still have sediment coming into our nearshore sediment transport system, our beaches are still likely to come back. If we experience whole-scale, pretty massive changes, a lot of shoreline hardening, that story may not be quite as favorable to the beaches, but we still will likely see some beach return. Okay, there's a little bit more information in here too, beyond the photos. So if we kind of scroll up in what's in here, there's these shoreline inventories through time, and this is where we can see things if we see what's selected. The shoreline classified based on beach protection, types as well as shore structures. So what do these colors and dots mean? We go over here to our legend, and we see the colors along the shore is how the beach basically is classified. And these dots are shore parallel structures, or excuse me, shore perpendicular structures. So these indicate all those groins we saw in the pictures. So you can see pretty heavily groin shoreline to the north and to the south of that beach area we were looking at. If we look at what was classified, this light blue color, there was a revetment behind that beach corresponding there. This green color, there's a series of seawalls and bulkheads behind those groins to the north. And then to the south, this gray color, there's no shore protection. That was just a natural beach without any hardening. For more information on this viewer, on our About page, all the data is available for download. And there is a tutorial video kind of walking through a little bit of what I talked about today, but for those of you who want a tutorial again about what this viewer can do and what information's in there, there's a nice video we made. And then of course, write-ups of all the data that's in there. Real quickly, another way to visualize this lake level change is the NOAA Lake Level Viewer. Again, favorite web search, Lake Level Viewer. You can go in, we'll look at the site, Lake Michigan. And what we see here, we can zoom in back to our site using the zoom bar up here. Zoom back into this North Beach site. And on the left here is what a lake level you can toggle. And by using the up and down button, you can change the lake level and see where the inundation extent is, indicated by the blue here. So at this long-term average lake level is indicating that the shoreline would be right at that interface there. This is a 2020 photo, so it may not look like a beach. We can toggle the water levels down, and we see the beach is exposed. We toggle, and that's what we saw in 2012. We toggle the water levels up to where we are currently, and we can see that matches pretty well with the 2020 photo. Intuitively, it's showing us the beach is getting narrower. And one thing we can sort of explore with this is, what if water levels went higher? What if we get a 2-foot storm surge? What might that inundation look like? We can push the water level up and see. Certainly the beach would be inundated here, but there'd still be some beach further up the shoreline, not so much. So this is a nice little tool to kind of get a quick estimate of visualization of what that water level inundation would do. This is not taking into account wave changes and erosion. This is sort of our first cut look at how inundation would impact our beaches. And of course, all this data is available for download, and you can play with it in GIS if you are so inclined, but the viewer is pretty valuable itself. I'll make a note, these hatched out areas are places where the LiDAR data that this tool is derived from maybe isn't so good. Maybe there was some issues with water clarity that day. So if you do see those hatched out areas, that's just where data is not available. So we won't be able to see what the changes are there. So in summary, how do water levels affect beach loss? Certainly through inundation, but also in concert with other processes, waves and changes to hardening of the shoreline, moving that sediment offshore. And then when water levels come down, we will see that most likely the beach will get revealed, and hopefully that sediment moves back on the beach to give us some of that sand back. And I just showcased a few tools that are useful for visualizing change, either to communicate what it's looked like in the past and where they've gone, or to get a better understanding of how things might look in the future. With that, I will put my contact information up, and thank you for your attention.
Great, thanks, Adam. We do have 2 questions that came in. The first one's from Mark. Does Wisconsin Sea Grant have a historical database of shore erosion and flooding issues along Lake Michigan from individual wind and high wave events? Say a list of shoreline issues after the January 10th to 11th storm in individual counties?
No, we don't have a database of that, I guess. I think maybe looking at, well, I won't say the Weather Service because the question's from the Weather Service, I think, but I think FEMA might have some documentation about that January 11th storm, because that's where a lot of damage reports went in. The Wisconsin Shore Viewer does have long-term recession rates on it for southeastern Wisconsin counties. We had some funding available to map that historically from the 1950s to 2015. That's the data that's available now, and hopefully we'll be able to map more locations in the future.
Great, thanks, Adam. And one final question from Cindy. The oblique photo viewers that you had showed, does the information there give climate naysayers ammunition that climate change does not affect water levels?
On the lake level viewer, that is a good question, because I think, you know, people can tend to draw conclusions that they want and confirmation bias from what evidence they see. You know, it is a little bit hard from discrete pictures of water level changes to say, well, that's climate change, that's not climate change. I think one of the big indicators is something that Dee showed in that precipitation graph, and how we've seen the wettest, you know, record-breaking year after record-breaking year of precipitation, and what that's doing to our shoreline. So I guess people probably could use it for confirmation bias, but I think it's important to try and put that into context too with the climate data itself.
Great, thank you, Adam. And I have to apologize that I always say your last name wrong. I know it's Beckley, and I still do it wrong. So thank you very much.
Very few people say it correctly.
I have it ingrained now that it's here. All right, thank you, Adam. And then next up is Julie Kinzelman. Julie, I am going to hand you control in just a moment.
Thanks.
You're welcome. And there you go.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to present on a case study of one of the sites that we're working on. I just started. I know it's important to reiterate that when we're talking about the beach, we're talking about comprehensive interactions that are occurring directly on site and perhaps further off site. And as Adam illustrated with his slides, there's a lot of influencing factors: the longshore current, the wave energy, the sediment supply, that can not only change the size and configuration of a beach, but also the delivery of pollutants. And those can further be influenced by land use and climate. And so we have to look at average long-term conditions and always look for change. I think that when I work, I never think that I'm done. I'm never done. There's always things that are changing, and it's a dynamic environment. With that, I think my approach, at least, is to have a systems thinking approach, to provide holistic analysis that focus on the way that the system's constituent parts are interacting with each other, as opposed to just viewing it each part independently. So this slide just shows some examples of some key components within the water, on the land, and the climate, and how they may interact. So the picture that you have here, you know, we always try to work within our means and work with combinations of gray and green infrastructure and with what Mother Nature's given us. This is a picture of North Beach that Adam showed that had a dune and swale system that was encouraged to capture sheet flow from the main parking lot that was compromised. And we can see that when it's doing its job, it provides capture and infiltration of stormwater runoff. And when it does not exist, when it's breached, unfortunately, through an unfortunate turn of events, not Mother Nature, we can see that dirty stormwater has now discharged across the beach face, significant rolling at the shoreline, and obviously degraded water quality. So in order to make something resilient, we want to maintain a balance between ecosystem function and utility. So when you have a recreational beach, obviously people want to use it. People have particular uses for the surrounding land. And in order for it to be sustainable and resilient, I have the capacity to recover. I think we look at a wide range of options, both hard engineered structures, green infrastructure, either restoring or preserving natural capital, and then planning and education. So this is Sam Myers Park. It's in downtown Racine. A bit of history. So this land was reclaimed land. So the picture on the left, you can see there's two offshore in-water structures. There's a third. They were installed in the city of Racine between 1920 and 1930 to provide shoreline erosion protection. So the city of Racine sits up on a bluff. Erosion is nothing new. You can see this little box. So in 1937, Sam Myers Park was in the lake. Move forward to 2014, and we can see that now there has been land. So in maybe the 1950s to the 1970s, there was the idea that we would reclaim this land and continue southward to create some sort of public amenity, harbors, marinas, park space. Obviously that stopped in the 1970s. But then what that left us with is a shoreline where there was a significant amount of accreted sand due to longshore sediments and poorer hydrodynamics. We can see prior to restoration, maybe like around 2013, we can see this is that piece of the existing breakwater from the 1920s and the accreted sediments, which were primarily occupied by Phragmites and black locusts and other invasive species. They're, as probably most people know, they're not good habitat, and they're also poor uptakers of nutrients. And in fact, the health department had posted a permanent swim ban at this area because of poor water quality. The site, because I think I have a better slide, but if you kind of visualize along here, this used to be an old like shore armor revetment. And so this at one point was all water. This here was the terminal end of a boat launch. Obviously that is a significant distance from the shoreline. This land lacked any elevation, so there was poor drainage other than drainage from the upland area of the park, to this low-lying area of dirty stormwater. You also had a wave runup during storm events. It was basically just a mucky mess. So having a laboratory, we started out assessing the site using the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding. We spent several years trying to determine what the hydrodynamics were within the site, what were the most likely sources of pollutant loading. So that involved taking offshore grab samples. In this kayak, we're actually towing a sonde that's underneath the kayak, so it's taking instantaneous readings of specific conductance and turbidity and temperature, and then we're pulling grab samples so that we can measure E. coli levels and other parameters. We did some dye testing to look at circulation patterns in the nearshore area, and then we also took depth readings and constructed bathymetric maps. And and we can see that these are the openings between the breakwaters. This little crosshair is some stormwater infrastructure that's discharged from the bluff. Now you can see from these contours that it was very shallow, except for where you had circulation. And so anything that would come in and get forced along the shoreline had quite a bit of a retention time. So with this information, we worked with Miller engineers and scientists out of Sheboygan, we came up with a conceptual design plan for the site, one that would address stormwater, because that was found to be one of the major drivers of water quality impairment, as well as provide us the opportunity to manage the invasive species and replace them with native plants. This site's in a migratory bird flyway. Native plants would obviously be favorable habitat, but they also are better uptakers of nutrients, and their deep root systems allow them to provide stabilization for the bounding structures of these constructed wetlands that we proposed and that were ultimately approved. Obviously, as we heard from the previous speakers, you know, when you make engineering plans, then you're looking at historic levels, lake levels, and conditions at the time that they're being drawn up. So obviously at this site, this legacy breakwater, you know, when it was designed with amount of freeboard to accommodate storm surges, it didn't account for historic high lake levels. You know, so that was one thing that we addressed, is the need to protect the land and raise the height of this for that effect. Also, in managing stormwater runoff, if you want to have some sort of public access, you're going to have to prevent erosion and stabilization of sandy soils. So these are just some conditions, you know, when we were at the outset prepping the site. You can see this is the upland area, the giant amount of stormwater that's kind of just sitting there. Then the boat launch area is kind of here, so it would just all pour down like a waterfall. So, you know, going on the engineering plans, I think it's important to put them in context, you know, of the best available knowledge, and that, you know, it might be this was a rather long-term project because it was costly over the years, and as we could look and get new information as we were doing the implementation, and then make adjustments. So this is just one example. This is a low-lying area in the upland area of the park. Originally, we had kind of a reverse. We had like a gazebo, and we had the picnic area up here, and we had needed to make some amendments to accommodate the fact that this was wet and not suitable for construction. But as you'll see in a later slide, it was also an opportunity to further capture stormwater and to create habitat. So looking at with the thought that when we designed the site that we would want it to be resilient, so being able to recover from storm damage. Like I said, we raised the height of this breakwater for about 200 linear feet, 3 to 4 feet. We also created some hydrologic connections to accommodate the fact that this is low-lying compared to the lake. So when you have a storm surge, this is actually perched lower in relation to the surface of the water. And the fact that creates pressure. So this is the landward side where the old revetment was in the breakwater. So obviously we have a dune feature here to help us manage the Phragmites, but also that's the kind of this is one side, this is the kind of leading edge of that. You know, and then you have where you want to put the public access, the walkway. You're going to have pressure. You need to accommodate the volume and flow of the water. And so these channels, hydrologic connections, help to regulate flow so that it's not overwhelmed. And then in the upland area, where we had all a significant amount of water just ponding, then we created some green infrastructure components. So this is a large rain garden. We have a bioswale, so this will capture landscape runoff from the turf grass areas, as well as impervious surface runoff from the asphalt drives. To prevent washout of this public access, we installed a French drain, and then some dissipators, you know, so if there's any sort of runoff that makes its way on either side of this to slow the flow volume. And here's just an overview of the site where you can see the flow of the water. So we have the parking lot, the impervious surface runoff, and was an existing culvert. Now it goes through the rain garden or off into this bioswale. Surface runoff is received by these two engineered or constructed wetlands that are geologically connected, and then there's 2 channels that then allow relief and passage of that stormwater should it become overwhelming into the embayment. Here's our opportunity. So this was where the picnic table was planned. Picnic tables, a picnic area was planned where it was wet, and we had to change the position on some of our engineering design plans. But since it was always wetted for long periods of time due to the snow melt and runoff, because it was a depression, we actually removed the top layer of sod and soils and dewatered it, and we amended the soils and planted it as a wet meadow. So now that retains water, it creates additional habitat, and then we're able to put in public access that's not continually inundated. We also planted numerous trees, upland and wetland stormwater trees. Trees not only once again create habitat, but they also have the ability to infiltrate stormwater and provide stabilization. I had a student, one of my graduate students from the University of Surrey in the UK, did his master's thesis, and his charge was to look at pre-restoration infiltration of precipitation based on soil types within Sam Myers Park, and also vegetation zones and numbers of trees. So prior to restoration, 40 to 52% of non-infiltrated precipitation was from the impervious surfaces. I think the impervious surfaces are still a contributor and will require offset, but we've provided now this obstruction to prevent the runoff in the lake by the installation of the 2 engineered or constructed wetlands. But we were encouraged to find that the infiltration of stormwater will increase when the trees reach maturity. And that the green infrastructure components of the rain garden, the bioswales, that engineered bioretention area are not anticipated to exceed capacity, even under climate change scenarios. So some good news, our design was sufficient based on current climate projections. Obviously, we have other opportunities to capture additional surface runoff should we need to, if the climate change scenarios prove true. Some other co-benefits of doing this combination of gray and green infrastructure are carbon sequestration. So at tree maturity, Sam Myers Park will remove carbon equivalent to 3.5 cars on the road. I mean, it's not a huge amount, but it's also only an 11-acre site and one of many sites in the city of Racine where we're also making a concerted effort to plant additional street trees and maintain our forested areas. As I said previously, it's in a migratory bird flyway. It's become one of the number 2 birding hotspot in Racine County. And the habitat amendments, replacing all those invasive species with native plant communities and trees, fruiting trees in particular. We've also planted like shrubs, native berries and nuts, and we've seen a return not only of migratory birds, but fish and reptiles, amphibians, mammals. And since it was a beach that, excuse me, that was permanently posted against swimming, we were interested in water quality improvements. And so it will take time as the plant communities mature to actualize benefits in the very near shore area. But we were able to remove the swim ban in 2017 and create an offshore swim zone, or not, beach in quotes. So you can see in the photo, a lot of people, because it's embayed and it's shallow, they anchor their boats in there and they swim from that area. And so we were able to establish a swim zone, and you can see that water quality in 2018 and 2019, it was open and available for swimming more than 95% of the time. So we were very happy with those results. However, obviously, I said additional mitigation is needed. So even though we tried and made this concerted effort to plan to make the site resilient and engineer to a high standard. In January 10th to 12th, we had a significant storm event. So we were at historic high or near historic high water levels in the right set of events that caused significant shoreline damage, not just at Sam Myers Park, but along the shorelines of Kenosha, Racine, and Milwaukee County. And we can see that even though we had all these connections and to try to accommodate volume and pressure, it obviously was not enough. So this pipe that was now, here's the end walls there and there, you know, this whole area was entirely obliterated, and a lot of, obviously the vegetation was lost. This movement of this whole area resulted in infill in the constructed wetlands areas. And so clearly we need to repair to pre-storm damage and also provide mitigation to come up with a way to further accommodate storm damage over and above what we anticipated. So Adam had talked about some of the tools that are available. So it's another one of my graduate students that's at Marquette University. He looked at the climate projections and lake level projections, and he plotted them over this site where we have our constructed wetlands and our public access pathways, and looking to see like this red line. So if we had a 3-foot increase in lake level rise, basically the whole site would be inundated, and this is where that historic revetment line and the boat launch would be. So it would go back to conditions in the 1970s. Versus these are kind of lower levels, maybe where we were in 2019. I'm in the wrong century, 2012, 2013. So we can see this is a wide range of what could possibly happen at this site, depending on lake levels and climate projections. And then this, we use the other tool. We looked at bluff and tow recession rates. So Sam Myers Park is here. Obviously, water quality is influenced, and the shoreline is influenced by sediment transport. So if these adjacent land parcels are suffering significant erosion, that can impact water quality here. So we went throughout Racine County and we looked at vulnerability. We plotted out bluff and tow recession rates and visited properties and took some photos. And I think that's informative to Sam Myers Park, but I mean, it's informative to the city, it's informative to the property owners. And I said at the very beginning of the talk, it's important to think of things kind of as a system. So it's sort of opportunities. We have comprehensive planning, I think, is necessary. I think, you know, it's impossible or nearly so to anticipate all potential events that could happen in the future, but amendments should be planned so that the site is as resilient as you can make it to fluctuations in lake levels and able to accommodate the large storm events. We found that a combination of gray and green infrastructure worked well, and that there were multiple co-benefits. And look at like with the nature-based solutions. And here's some examples. So this is where the rain garden and the bioswale are, and where we did the bioretention. But obviously, there's other low-lying areas in this park, so there's opportunities for the future to create similar such areas or to make some of these hard surfaces permeable. And I think the biggest thing in that we had to raise 100% of the money for this site redesign is to incorporate elements that allow access to multiple funding streams. And so in this site, we're managing non-point source pollution runoff, we're creating public access, we're creating habitat, we're maintaining native plant communities and managing invasive species. And so in taking the holistic approach to the site, you're also open to opportunities to partner and to use different funding streams to actualize your plans. So Sam Myers is a little worse for the wear as a result of the January 10th through 12th storm. You can actually see here the line, where the storm impacts were. There's a clear line of demarcation where there's lush vegetation and where there's very sparse vegetation, but I think it's still beautiful. It's still functional. We retained, the majority of the site on the western end, and the native plant communities survived, and we still have a lot of benefits that we're actualizing from the site, even as we work towards restoring to pre-storm damage conditions and providing mitigation. So, my staff, I have great staff. I couldn't do it. We're small but mighty. We only have 4 full-time staff in my department. They work very hard. We obviously work with lots of students. I think that's great for them to be able to apply what they're learning. So both local, regional, international students, and we couldn't do it without the funders, which are too many to list here, but all appreciated, because we'd never be able to make it happen without them. And I think that's it. If anybody, I don't know how we're doing for questions, if there's time. Right. If anybody, Todd, were you looking, people chatting in questions?
Thanks, Julie. That was a great presentation. Before we get into some questions, there are some questions for you, Julie. Natalie is going to put some information in the chat about a post-webinar survey that we would really appreciate you filling out so we can help plan our future webinars, and then also put in the link to our Coastal Beaches Working Group site and the link again to join our webinar list, or our listserv for those who are interested. And we'll start with a couple of those questions for you, Julie, before we open it back up. While there's still a little bit of time, if anyone has additional questions for Adam or Deanna as well. So Julie, one question from Peter is, what was the time frame for this project, and how long was construction and restoration versus analysis? And then is there an ongoing monitoring plan in place?
So we used about 4 years worth of data to make a determination of what the drivers of poor water quality were, which included permitting time. So it was permitted by both Wisconsin DNR and Army Corps of Engineers. The permit was for 3 years for construction. So we raised the money and did all the construction within 3 years. The Army Corps of Engineers our permit carries a wetland mitigation reporting requirement for 5 years past the end date of construction. I anticipate we would continue monitoring the site and managing invasive species and things past that, but so monitoring continues, water quality monitoring, groundwater, surface water, plant community assessments continue as long as we're able. We usually start in April and go till people can't work outside anymore.
Thanks, Julie. So Richard also had a question which you answered a little bit in your presentation later, but he wanted to know how your work affected water quality at the beach and also water clarity. So I know you touched on water quality a little bit, but could you speak about any changes to water clarity, if you noticed any?
I think at times, right, the turbidity, we haven't this year. We didn't go out because to do the whole embayment assessment, but in previous years the water clarity was better. The plant communities provide stabilization, so we have less erosion, less delivery of silts and fines, obviously impeding that stormwater runoff from the upland area. We're able to capture and infiltrate stormwater runoff that could have silts and fines, and so we saw some improvement in water clarity. And we'd like to do that whole embayment assessment again. to monitor change over time.
Thanks, Julie. Mark had a question for you. How will you adjust future park infrastructure to adapt to events like the January storm?
We can have more storage. So I showed on the last slide some opportunities where we could have more storage in the upland area. We can look at opportunities. I said to have more impervious surfaces up. Part of the damage resulted from the fact that the portions of the breakwater failed. So the breakwater extends for a long distance, outside of the confines of Sam Myers Park, going to the north. And so when that failed, then we had unanticipated volumes of water coming, from the upland area that normally would not occur. So as we rebuild the breakwater and provide mitigation, I mean, we will work with coastal engineers to gather suggestions for providing the mitigation. But I think stormwater retention is always key, and we still have to look at the size of the channels and the pipe, and the connections between the constructed wetlands to make sure that we can accommodate volume and flow.
Thanks, Julie. So I don't see any additional questions in the chat. So thanks everyone for joining our second webinar. I hope that you guys got some useful information out of this. If you have additional questions for our presenters, please feel free to email them directly. Natalie has put contact information in the chat, or feel free to email one of the webinar organizers, and we'll happily forward your questions on to our presenters. And then just one last reminder, if you have a chance, please fill out the survey for us. We get a lot of really useful information about how we can help beach users and beach managers, and what information is useful to you guys to hold a webinar about. So with that, I'd like to give one last thank you and virtual applause to our presenters. Thank you, Deanna, Adam, and Julie. We really appreciated it, and you guys showed a lot of really great information here today. And I hope everyone on the webinar has a great rest of your day, and that you continue to stay safe and healthy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.